the church, in fact, and we understand that mental illness is everywhere around us, it seems, nowadays. But what has been a real concern to us is first identifying some of that, and we understand that there is clinical depression. There are cases where people need professional help, where there are chemical imbalances or physical problems that reside within a person that our medical community can help. And that's important to do that. And then we recognize, too, that we all have a bit of a struggle at times. I mean, nobody seems to be free from the blues or from depression based on things that go on within our lives. And so lately here we've been looking at a couple individuals. And last week, we spent quite a bit of time talking about Jonah. And the miserable character that Jonah seems to be, right? God asked him, he's God's mouthpiece at this time. He asked him to go to Nineveh, a city of his enemies, and to proclaim to them that doom is coming to them because of what they have done, their lifestyle and such. And remember, Jonah wants no part of this, and he runs in the opposite direction. He gets on a ship, and of course we all know what we think of as a child's Bible class story, but very applicable to you and I. He's running in the opposite direction. We find out that his attitude is that he sees God as a forgiving and a relenting God, a God that will warn and give opportunity and long-suffering. And so he doesn't want this for the people in Nineveh. He wants them to meet a doom. And so after that three-part lesson of being in that fish, for a little while, he's spewed back up on land. He goes to Nineveh, and what? He travels a day's walk into the city, makes this simple proclamation, and the city repents. And even to the cattle, they don themselves with sackcloth and ashes, and they turn away. And then remember, he kind of stomps away and sits on the hillside watching the city, right? And then God teaches him a lesson with that plant that springs up, and it provides him shade, and he's comforted by that. He's happy for the plant. And remember, the next morning, God sends a what? A worm, and a worm kills the plant. And now he is in the sunlight and the breeze, and he wants to die. And then God answers him. And basically, we find out that God is pretty upset with him, that he does not have compassion for this great city and these great many people. And so we assume Jonah is taught a lesson, but he never replies. His last words are in quite contrary to God's ideals or his plan. And so God is, we're left at the book of Jonah where God basically sets him straight. We can only assume what happens from there. Today I would like, any thoughts about Jonah before we move into a new character? Today I'd like us to think about Elijah. And if you would turn to 1 Kings. Elijah is another character. If we think about this happened, 2,800 years ago, something like that. And we find a man that is going through a lot. And so he goes through a good amount of depression. We're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 17. And we could honestly take what is given to Jonah for advice or for cure, if you will, for his depression, and it could be written by some of the best psychiatric minds of today, I think. It really would fit well with today's age. So let's think about this a little bit. Really this people, like I said, about 2,800 years ago, these are very primitive people, and yet they're dealing with the same things that you and I think deal with today. And so Elijah displays a lot of the symptoms of a depressed person or patient, if you will. He is really finds himself at the end of hope and tries to escape life simply by running away. Let's look a little bit at what has preceded this, though, and how God has used Elijah as we come to his point of despair. In 1 Kings chapter 17, it's really quite remarkable, the things that he goes through. Now Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel is, before whom I stand, surely there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." And so Elijah holds the ability for rain to come and go within his words. It's been given to him. And so God working through him is going to affect some change upon his people. And Elijah's God's man at this point, and so it's going to be by his word. And we understand that later on, he's going to make proclamation, and eventually it will rain. So God is working directly through him. And then notice verse 2. Go away from here. Verse 2, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Go away from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook." And so you wonder, well, why is God sending him away? Well, I think because the wheels are about to come off the cart, right? These people are going to go into deep despair with no rain, with this drought that's about, or this famine that's about to come. And so he takes care of him. Notice in verse 6 of chapter 17. "And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he would drink from the brook." And so now he's on this, let's call it a journey, and God is providing for him by the birds of the air. They are bringing him his food. And so he is being supplied. Now think of that. That's not just one occasion, but it's morning and night, and as it goes on, he is continually taken care of by God. In fact, when the brook dries up, then he moves on. He's told to move on, and he's going to meet another character in the story. So chapter 17 and verse 14 through 16, you remember he is sent to a widow, and she has very little. In fact, she has enough flour and oil for one meal left, and when Elijah asks her what she's doing, she says, "I'm about to fix this meal, and we're going to die," because that's the last of her food. And Elijah said to her "Do not fear," verse 13, "go do as you have said, but make me a little bread cake for it first, and bring it to me, and afterward you may make one for yourself and for your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bowl of flour shall not be exhausted, nor shall the jar of oil be empty until the day of the Lord sends rain on the face of the earth." So she went and did according to the word of Elijah, and she and her household ate for many days. The bowl of flour was not exhausted, nor did the jar of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke through Elijah. Now notice again, the word of the Lord coming through Elijah. And so he's this conduit, right? And he has to, does he not have to recognize what he is, or the position that he is in? Here he's in front of a woman and a son that are basically as good as dead after the next meal. And they understand that. And yet God works through him and says, "No, make something for me first." And so I think that's maybe an opportunity for her to show some faith or to display something. And she does that. And they are rewarded by the bowl of flour and the jar of oil not being exhausted, but rather sustaining all of them as they go forward. Which is, again, you have to recognize that if you're Elijah, right? It's what God is working here. Yes?
She's not an Israelite either. She only lives 8 miles from Sidon, where Jezebel grew up. So she was probably a Baal worshiper, yet she recognized the God of Israel.
Right. And no doubt a desperate woman. No doubt, these are terrifically trying times on all of the populace. Yeah, good point. Anybody else? So here again, God is working through Elijah. Then her son becomes ill. I think verse 16, "Now after it came after these things, that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became sick. And his sickness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. He dies. So she said to Elijah, 'What do I have to do with you, O man of God?'" Notice how she refers to him. "You have come to me to bring my iniquity to remembrance and to put my son to death." He said to her, "Give me your son." Then he took him from her bosom and carried him up to the upper room where he was lying, and laid him on his bed, or living, and laid him on his own bed. He called to the Lord and said, O Lord my God, have you also brought calamity to the wicked, with whom I am staying, by causing her son to die? Sometimes you come across a verse in Scripture, and, okay, he says this, he's kind of accusatory of God, right? About bringing this calamity upon this woman that's actually helping him. But it doesn't mean that it's the case. It doesn't mean that that's what has happened here. That's just his complaint. That's his retort to God. And I think that gives us a little bit of insight into maybe some of the character, some of what mentally is going on in the mind of Elijah. And here again, under great stress, right? And yet God has been providing for him. God has been taking care of him. You and I, we all recognize that bad things happen, right? Even bad things happen to good people. Bad things happen to people when they're trying to do good. And so even though this woman recognizes that this is a man of God, and yet her son has died, it's overwhelming her, and she says, have you brought to my remembrance my iniquity? Is that why this is happening? Am I being kicked because I'm down, because I'm a sinner, basically, is what her attitude seems to be. It would be pretty hard, I think, for us to fault her at the death of her son for saying something like that, right? And yet, Elijah doesn't, he's questioning these things too. And he says, he talks to God in verse, 21, and he stretched himself out upon the child 3 times and called the Lord, O my Lord God, I pray you, let this child's life return to him. And the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child returned to him, and he revived. Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room into the house, and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, see, your son is alive. Makes you wonder how old the child was. It talks about him carrying, talks about him laying across him 3 times. This seems like the son would be rather young. Then the woman said to Elijah, verse 24, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. She doesn't need any more convincing, right? if the jar of flour and the oil wasn't enough, her receiving her son back alive, she is a believer, apparently. So we have this episode again. Now, I sometimes wonder where God's faithful men do something, like he's praying for the life of the child. I wonder sometimes if they're not the most surprised at God's answer. This looks like quite a scene, right? I'm sure Elijah is this is troublesome to him. This woman has suffered a great loss, and he's in her presence, and God has helped them to this point, and now this child dies. And yet, I wonder what his attitude was when the child is restored. Did he believe it was going to happen? Was he mustering that faith as he prayed to God? Or was he surprised as the woman to see her child take breath again? I don't know. Things that make me wonder sometimes. So the son is restored. And then maybe one of the episodes that we think of most often when we think of Elijah, it happens with the prophets of Baal, right? There's about 400 of these false prophets. And there's this great showdown, right? So 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 25, 18 and 25. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one ox for yourselves and prepare it first for your many. And call in the name of your God, but put no fire under it. And so what he's doing is he's challenging them basically. You don't put fire under this, but call upon your God to put the fire under it. Then they took the ox which was given them, and they prepared it and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they leaped about the altar which they made. And it came about at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, call out with a loud voice. For he is God, either he is occupied or gone aside, or is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and needs to be awakened. And so, here we see a little different side of Elijah, right? He's rather enjoying this. He has challenged the 450 prophets of Baal to light this fire, basically without matches. Like, let your God light the fire. And so call upon him to do this. After all, you are a great number. You just see him. And he's over here now, and as they're making requests to their God and no answer comes, he starts to frustrate them, starts to chide them, or really give it back to them by saying, oh, well, maybe he's occupied, or gone aside, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep. You just got to get louder. So they cried out, verse 28, with a loud voice, and cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances, until the blood gushed out on them. I think this is probably hard for you and I to envision. This is probably not quite as benign as we might think. These people were bleeding. They were really committed here, right? And so it says the blood gushed out on them. When midday was past, they raved until the time for the offering of the evening sacrifice, but there was no voice, and no one answered, and no one paid attention. And so you can just see this going on. These 450 are just consumed with their rituals, with bleeding themselves and calling out to Baal, and yet nothing has happened. And those that have lost attention are the people. You got to remember here that it's not just the 450 prophets of Baal and Elijah, but the community is watching. The people are watching this go on, and that's who this is really for. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." So all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord which had been torn down. Elijah, and what a scene that was. I'm putting back what God has authorized, what God has asked for. Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Israel shall be your name. Matt and I were just talking about that number 12 on Wednesday night. There were 12 apostles. One was lost and one was added. For some reason, there had to be 12. There were 12 stones. There were 12 sons of Jacob. So with the stones, he built an altar, verse 32, in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 measures of seed. Then he arranged the wood, and I think that's just a unit of measurement to help us understand how big, even though you and I probably have a hard time comprehending it. Then he arranged the wood and cut the ox into pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, fill 4 pitchers full of water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. And he said, do it a second time. And then he said, and they did it a second time. Then he said, do it a third time, and they did it a third time. The water flowed around the altar and also filled the trench with water. So you can just see this, right? Everything is saturated. Everything is soaking wet at this point. At the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. And so this is for the benefit, not just a prayer to God, but it's for the benefit of the crowd that's watching, for the people. Answer me, O Lord, verse 37. Answer me that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. And all the people saw it, and they fell on their faces, and they said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. What's so sad about this occasion is it takes this to get them to recognize that. They have fallen away from him. They have chased after the prophet of Baal. They played the harlot with the Lord, which is a common theme that we see through God's scripture dealing with these people. And it takes this lesson for them to see the power of God. And can you just see the setting? Here is one sacrifice that has been I hate to say prayed over, but yearned over all day long to create fire on it. And here's another one that by all of natural purposes is saturated wet, not going to burn, and it is licked up in an instant. Not only that, but the altar itself. And so a great sign of power here. And so he's God's man. That was his prayer. Let these people see that you are the Lord and that I am your man. And so that he's vindicated. he is proven to be God's mouthpiece. Yes, Micaiah?
So, question, is this still also during the time of drought?
Yeah.
So, then in that case, another thing about the water itself.
Your value, yeah.
The value of
Yeah.
the water. Just because of the fact that if rivers are drying up, that means that water is valuable. And so, it's one of those things where when the water is lifted up, it's also a sacrifice to God as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure it's at the time of the drought, yeah. Okay, excellent. And you remember, now what happens, remember, the people seize the prophets of Baal. They're killed right there. And then word gets back to who? Anybody remember?
The king.
The king, and then he tells who? His wife, Jezebel. And remember Jezebel, we hear that name and it's like the bad is bad, there's Jezebel. And so she's like co-ruler. Remember, Jezebel is the daughter of Ethbal, the king of, Old Testament scholars, Tyre. Remember, Tyre's that city up on the coastline, and it's a city that controls a lot of the area by now, and it's out in the water. The city itself is basically an island into itself. It's very hard to penetrate. And remember, about 300 or maybe more like 500 years from now, Alexander the Great, during that time of silence where we don't have anything written in our Bible's history, for about, 400 years, there's a time period in there. Alexander the Great comes down to defeat these people, and he despises the city of Tyre. And what does he do? He builds a land bridge or a causeway, scrapes the ground clean down to the rock, throws it all in the sea, and puts his army onto the city after like a 7 or 8 month siege. And so he lets them get good and weak, and then he builds his own land bridge to defeat these people. A great, fascinating story of a warrior that finally destroys this city. Probably, I shouldn't say probably, but a destroyed city by God's design that happens. Well, we're not receiving anything from God's writers. It's really kind of a cool thing. But Jezebel is a mean, nasty lady. And she writes back, or she says back to Elijah that you've killed all my prophets, and so me if I don't have your life by this time tomorrow. And so the race is on, and Elijah is running for his life. Chapter 19. So verse 3 goes to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. But verse 4, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die. And said, it is enough for me now, O Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. You know, we seem to be coming across a common theme here, right? God's men doing faithful things, but then getting discouraged and saying, okay, I'm done. Let it be over for me. Take my life. You know? And so that's the point at which Elijah is at. What caused Elijah's depression? Let's think about this a little bit. You know, he was fixated on himself here in verse 3 and 4, right? Or in verse 4. All he could see was his situation. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2. Hebrews chapter 12. Starting in verse 2. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Now, there's a timing problem here, I understand. Elijah could not look at the example of Christ, right? That was still to come. And yet, what has God done for him? What has God done through him? And yet he finds himself isolated and in despair. And to the point that he says, I am no better than my fathers. Just go ahead and let it be done with me. Let it be over. He had lost where his eyes needed to be, right? I mean, he should have been focused on God. He had seen all of these things. And I guess when you say see, you got to use a biblical definition, is to understand. It's one thing to physically see something, it's something else to see it, to understand it. But he had to understand what was going on. God was working through him. And yet he's in this great place of despair. You know, you and I, once again, we talk about how Jesus is like the ultimate example in everything that we can think of. Now, if you and I are Elijah, or living the life of Elijah, we're trying to be God's person, we're trying to be faithful, and yet we're being bombarded, we are being chased, we're being harangued, we find ourselves alone, and we're ready to give up in whatever state that is, give up being a good person, give up being a Christian, give up life. We have Christ as our example to look at and see what he went through. And what did he go through? It says, verse 3, consider who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. I dare say we will not have to outlive Christ's example. You know, sometimes it's a little frustrating to me. I see young people saying, well, I don't want to be a Christian. You see this out there. I don't want to be a Christian because I see ones that are older than me that have done it wrong. Or they, you know, how can they call themselves a Christian? Or how can they be considered faithful when they've done bad things? And yet, they allow that to stop them. If they have to pick their feet up and go over a Christian's example to be faithful themselves, that's what they should do. You know, when Peter asked Jesus, how many times do we forgive? Like we talked about a few months ago in our class about forgiveness, he said 70 times 7, right? And some Christians, it seems, are fraught with that. They have to continually ask for forgiveness. And who am I to say some Christians? I mean, it seems like we all have a struggle or two, right? And something that just continually seems to grab us. And I have to continually ask for forgiveness. Well, I could see somebody having to step over my example in that regard. But I pray they do. I don't want to stop someone from being faithful. But we're not going to have to outdo Christ. We're not going to have to suffer the things that he did. And if we did suffer somewhat like that, our attitude should be that of Paul and Barnabas, that we were found suitable to suffer for his name's sake. I think sometimes that would maybe be easier for us. I think sometimes to myself, if I could just be beaten, be considered faithful, and go. That sounds easier than the struggles of today Christian living. Tell me I'm wrong. Sometimes I think taking a beating would be better. But then we go back and we read Matthew and we see what Jesus went through. And we see how it was his own people. And he was deserted by his followers. And he was left there to stand alone, having all of the power, all of the ability to step outside of his physical self and have it be over. But he endured. And he endured for that example that you and I need. And I think here Elijah has lost sight of what God has done for him, even though he doesn't have Christ's example yet. Understand that. Any thoughts about that before we move on?
I think it shows how much patience God does have, and he does know we're dust, because Elijah's given up, but he didn't give up on Elijah.
Right.
And when Jonah gave up doing God's will, he didn't give up on Jonah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
right.
he keeps reminding, and
right.
okay, the woman was being fed by Elijah through God, or through God, etc. And even got her son back. I mean, he doesn't just give you one miracle, because sometimes we say, oh, if we had just seen Jesus do one miracle, but
and that's where I'm headed with this is, what do we
good enough
see?
for us.
Right,
Sometimes.
Exactly. Think about that. What do we see? You know, another thing, he demanded too much of himself. He says in verse 4, I am no better than my ancestors. Yes?
You know, we gotta remember that Satan never gives up on us. And he looks for every opportunity of weakness. And even as we get older and older and we think come upon us, we see different things, and it affects us greatly. And all we gotta do is let our guard down, lose sight of the mark for a split second.
Right.
And you know, we start feeling despair, or like, hey, take me, Lord. I can't say that I've not experienced that. There's times, you know, then you gotta come to your senses and realize that we're gonna be tried, we're gonna go through that.
Right.
But keep our eye on the mark, and our God will throw us away.
He says in verse 4, I am no better than my ancestors. Now, you think about where he's coming from. Is he talking about the unfaithful in his nation? Is he talking about those that have tried to be faithful, and he's tried, but he just can't muster it? But at any point, I think this is kind of a debilitating thing for his attitude, for his mindset. I am no better than my ancestors. I don't know that our Christian faith is a race against those that have gone before us, even within our own families, if you will. But you know, when we think of the Hebrew writer talking to us about that great cloud of witnesses that are watching us, those heroes of faith that we learned about just in the previous chapter. It says now, let's go on, let's win the race, let's go forward like this crowd is watching us and cheering for us. That's the way I'd like to think of those that have preceded me. That they are yearning for me to be successful, to move on, and who doesn't want the next generation, your children, to go further than you? We all want that, and of course that's one of the things that we're lacking now in our society, in our economy. That it's likely that our children are going to not get to the place that we were. It's a sad reality that's starting to set in because of economic situations and what have you. But when it comes to faith, man, we want them to achieve and to do. But here he's using this, or this is kind of a debilitating thought, it seems to me. I am no better than my ancestors. Any thoughts about Elijah's complaint here? Yes, Ron.
Well, I just wondered, because he stood up against all these men, all these prophets, 450 plus the king.
Yeah.
And I think it seems like he feels like he defeated Baal maybe in the nation, and then one word from Jezebel sends him down.
Wipes it all out.
Does he feel like, well, I did all this work, but yet, Baal's still gonna thrive here because I'm no better than Moses, who tried to get the Israelite people.
And that could very well be. That could very well be his mindset, which would be incorrect, which would be wrong. After all, God is in control, right? And think about that. Think of the men of old that lived and yearned to see what God had promised and what was coming, but didn't get to see it. But they lived by faith and mustered as far as their days took them, and then they died. And then another generation, and another generation. And then we eventually get to the point where that arrives. And can you imagine, as Christ appears on the scene and men start to put together what this is? And so, it's almost like the struggling athletic team that they're not going to win this year. But with hard work, those seniors and those juniors can help train up those sophomores and freshmen, and they're going to win. They're going to be much more successful than this team. And that almost seems like us, right? Like they kept moving the ball ahead, But now we have everything at our fingertips. We know the entire story. And it's simply our lack of study or our desire to really implement and to use and to teach others that we don't achieve the things that we should, because we literally have everything at our fingertips now. Any last thoughts about better than my ancestors?
You know,
Yeah.
Paul at one point in his life was tired too.
Yeah.
And he says, I wish I could die.
Yep.
But if it's better for me to stay here and work with you, that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
But his whole thought was, let you have your will with me, dear God, you know?
Yep. Yeah, and no doubt he was tired. Look at what he had gone through, what he had endured to that point. Certainly, and yet understanding what was best for those around him and the writing that he was to do yet. Notice that, yes, Marcia.
And then he was fed, especially right here, by an angel. I mean,
Right.
he was weak, and he was
He
tired,
was.
and he was hungry, and so he physically was unable to go
Yes.
on. But they did take care of him.
Yep.
And I think sometimes we do have to just lay down and rest.
Yep. Verse 5. He lay down and slept under a juniper tree, and behold, there was an angel touching him, and he said to him, Arise, eat. This is the next thing, the next point. He was exhausted. He was hungry. Then he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake, baked on a hot stone, and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. This repeats itself. The angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, Arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you. And he rose and he ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. And so that's where he's headed to now, and that's where we're going to pick the story up next week. But he becomes hungry, and he wasn't taking care of himself. And sometimes when we get in these positions, our physical body is yearning for something, and yet mentally we don't supply it. We don't recognize it. We're unwilling to take care of it. And so sometimes when we're not even hungry, we need to eat. Sometimes when something is needed, we need to take care of that. There's a couple other things here that cause Elijah's depression. And we'll pick those things up, talking about loneliness and isolation next week. And perhaps he was taking God for granted. And we'll finish up our discussion on Elijah next week. That was 2 days, right? All right. Thanks for your attention, everybody.
Yeah, we did.